My mother's voice was calm when she said it, which is what made it so unbearable. The house is gone, Rachel. We sold it in March. I stood in her kitchen holding a coffee mug that had been my grandmother's, the one with the chipped rim and the faded blue rooster, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me even though nothing in the room had moved. 6 words. That was all it took to erase 11 years of promises, of Sunday dinners where my grandmother had looked me dead in the eye and said, "This house is yours, Rachel. Whatever happens to me, whatever happens to anyone else in this family, that house on Cedar Lake belongs to you." I set the mug down before my hands could betray me by shaking. Sold it to who? I asked, and my mother wouldn't look at me. My father, sitting at the table with the newspaper he wasn't reading, cleared his throat and said the name of my younger brother's father-in-law, a man named Frank Delgado who ran a real estate investment company 2 towns over. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because it felt like the punchline to a joke I hadn't been told yet. "You sold Grandma's house to Danny's father-in-law." My mother finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't guilt. It was relief. The relief of someone who had been carrying a secret so heavy that even its ugly reveal felt lighter than the silence had been. I need you to understand who I was before that afternoon, because the woman who walked out of that kitchen was not the same woman who walked in. I was 44 years old, divorced, no children, working as a paralegal at a small firm in Millbrook, the kind of town where everybody's grandmother knew everybody's business. I had spent the better part of a decade being the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who drove 90 minutes every single weekend to sit with my grandmother, Eleanor, after her stroke, the one who fed her, bathed her when the aide didn't show, read her the same 3 Agatha Christie novels until she knew the endings by heart and still wanted to hear them again. My brother Danny visited twice a year. My parents visited when it was convenient, which in my father's case meant almost never, because my father and my grandmother had never gotten along, not since he married her only daughter and moved her 3 states away from the family she loved. But I went. Every single weekend, rain or shine, holidays included, and somewhere in the 3rd year of that routine, my grandmother took my hand in hers, the good hand, the one the stroke hadn't stolen from her, and she told me the lake house was mine. Not someday. Not eventually. Hers and then mine. She said it more than once. She said it in front of witnesses. And I had believed her, the way you believe the ground will hold you when you take a step, without thinking about it, without needing proof, because some truths feel too solid to require documentation. My grandmother died 8 months before that afternoon in my mother's kitchen. She died in the house she loved, in the bedroom that looked out over the water, with me holding her hand and my mother somewhere in the hallway on the phone with the funeral home, already, even then, moving faster than grief should allow. I remember thinking it was strange, how quickly the practical machinery of death started grinding before the body was even cold. I remember thinking I was being unfair, that grief makes people move in strange ways, that my mother needed the phone call to keep her hands busy so she wouldn't have to feel the thing in her chest. I gave her grace. I gave everyone grace for months, because that is what I had been raised to do, to assume the best, to be the daughter who didn't make waves. It took me a long time to understand that my willingness to give grace was the exact thing they had been counting on. The will, when it was read, 6 weeks after the funeral, in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, said the lake house would go to my daughter Carol Whitfield to distribute among my grandchildren as she sees fit. I remember the sentence like it's carved into me. My grandmother's own attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Aldrich, who had drafted wills in that county for 30 years, read it out loud in a room with me, my parents, and Danny sitting in stiff chairs that didn't match. I looked at my mother. I expected her to turn to me right there, in front of the lawyer, and say what we both knew was true, that Grandma wanted me to have it, that this language was just her mother's old-fashioned way of keeping things simple, trusting her daughter to do right by her granddaughter. My mother did not turn to me. She stared straight ahead at Mr. Aldrich, and something in her jaw was tight in a way I had never seen before, and I told myself it was grief. For months after that, Nothing happened, or nothing that I was told about. I assumed, foolishly, generously, that my mother was working through the logistics, that the house would eventually be transferred into my name, that there was paperwork and probate and patience required. I called twice to ask, gently, careful not to seem greedy, careful not to be the daughter who made things about money 3 months after burying her grandmother. Both times my mother told me it was being handled. I believed her. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters. I believed my own mother when she told me a thing was being handled, because believing her cost me nothing and doubting her felt like a betrayal I wasn't willing to commit. And that is exactly the kind of daughter they had raised. One who would rather be wronged in silence than accuse her own family of lying to her face. The truth came out in pieces, the way truth usually does, not in one clean cut but in 100 small ones that you don't notice bleeding until you're lightheaded. The first piece was a text from my cousin Marissa, Danny's wife's cousin actually, a woman I barely knew, congratulating me on the family's smart investment. Saying she'd heard the lake property sold for well over asking, and wasn't that wonderful for everyone? I stared at that text for 11 minutes before I understood what it meant. The second piece was a photograph, posted publicly, foolishly, by Frank Delgado's real estate company, a before and after post showing renovation plans for a charming lakefront property recently acquired. The photograph in the before panel was my grandmother's porch, the one with the wind chimes I'd hung the summer after her stroke, the wind chimes she used to ask me to ring closer to her window so she could hear them at night. That was the day I drove to my parents' house uninvited, on a Tuesday, and stood in the kitchen, and heard my mother say the house is gone in that terrible calm voice, and heard my father not say anything at all, which was somehow worse. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I have never been a screamer. What I did was ask questions, quiet and precise, the way I'd been trained to ask them at the law firm, because some instinct in me, some cold, clear part that would later save everything, understood that emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. When exactly did you sign the sale? I asked. My mother said March. When did you first list it? My father, finally looking up, said January. So you listed my grandmother's house for sale 6 weeks after her funeral, and you never told me. Neither of them answered that one. I asked how much they'd sold it for. My mother said a number that made something in my stomach fold in on itself, a number nearly double what the house had been worth 5 years earlier, because lakefront land in that county had exploded in value and everyone who'd grown up there knew it. I asked where the money was. My mother said it had been distributed appropriately among the family, and something about the word appropriately, so bloodless, so legal-sounding coming out of my own mother's mouth, made me understand that whatever grace I had left for these people was finished. I left without raising my voice. I got in my car, drove 11 minutes to a gas station, and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, because I couldn't trust my hands on the wheel. And it was there, in that parking lot, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, that I remembered the folder. 3 years before my grandmother's stroke, back when she was still sharp as a blade and twice as stubborn, she had called me into her study one Sunday afternoon while my parents were out running errands, and she'd handed me a manila folder, sealed with a strip of packing tape she'd clearly put there herself. "Don't open this now," she'd said. "Don't tell your mother I gave it to you. Just put it somewhere safe, and if anything ever happens with the house, anything at all that feels wrong, you open it." I remember asking her what was in it, and she'd smiled the particular smile she used when she was being deliberately mysterious, a smile I'd inherited from her and used myself more than I'd like to admit, and she'd said, "Insurance, sweetheart. Every smart woman keeps insurance nobody knows about." I had put that folder in the bottom drawer of my file cabinet at home, under old tax returns, and over the following years I had genuinely forgotten it existed. The way you forget an umbrella in the trunk of your car until the exact moment it starts to rain. I drove home that night, past the exit for my apartment, circling the block twice before I could make myself go inside, and I pulled the folder out of that drawer with hands that were finally, actually shaking. Inside was a document I did not expect. Not a will, not a deed, but something my grandmother, in her sly, careful way, had arranged years before her stroke, back when she still had full command of her faculties and no one could later claim undue influence or diminished capacity. It was a recorded life estate interest, filed with the county recorder's office, granting my grandmother the right to live in the house for her lifetime, and stating explicitly, in language even a layperson could understand, that upon her death the remainder interest in the property transferred directly to me, Rachel and Whitfield, by name. Not to my mother to distribute. Not to the estate. To me, directly, automatically, by operation of law, the instant my grandmother's heart stopped beating. It had been recorded 11 years earlier. It predated the will Mr. Aldrich had read aloud by nearly a decade. And, because a properly recorded life estate deed transfers property outside of probate, outside of any will, outside of any decision my mother could make about how to distribute anything, that house had never, not for one single day, belonged to my mother to sell. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 o'clock at night with that document in my lap, and I laughed and cried at the same time, an ugly, gasping sound I'm glad no one was there to hear, because I finally understood something my grandmother had understood all along. She hadn't trusted my mother either. She had loved her daughter, but she hadn't trusted her, not with this, and she had built a second, quieter truth underneath the one everyone else could see, a truth with my name already written into the county records years before anyone thought to lie to me. I did not call my mother that night. I did not call anyone. I went to work the next morning and I asked my supervising attorney, a sharp, tired woman named Judith Okafor who had seen every kind of family ugliness cross her desk in 30 years of practice, if she would look at something for me, off the clock. As a favor. She read the recorded deed twice. She looked up at me with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between pity and something close to delight. Rachel, she said, if this is what I think it is, your mother didn't just make a mistake. She sold a house she never owned. And, depending on how this Delgado transaction was structured, that means the sale itself may be void, which means you may not just have a claim against your family. You may still, legally, own that house. What followed over the next several weeks was not the kind of revenge you see in movies, no screaming confrontations, no thrown dishes, though God knows there were nights I wanted that release. What followed was quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating. Judith helped me file a formal notice with the county, establishing my recorded interest and putting the current title on record as clouded, meaning no future buyer could purchase that property with clean legal standing until my claim was resolved. I did this without telling my parents. I let 3 more weeks pass, weeks in which my mother texted me twice, breezy, unbothered texts asking if I wanted to get lunch, as though she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my life. I did not respond. I was gathering. I contacted the title company that had handled the Delgado sale and requested, as a matter of public record, copies of the closing documents. I discovered, buried in the fine print, that my mother had signed an affidavit swearing she had full authority to convey the property as sole distributee under the will, an affidavit that was, factually, a lie, whether she'd known it or not, because the will had never had authority over that property in the first place. Here is where the story could have gone one way, the easy way, the way I'd been trained my whole life to choose: quietly settle, take a payout, avoid the scene, protect the family peace even though the family had shown no interest in protecting mine. I thought about it. There were nights I genuinely considered it, sitting alone in my apartment with the recorded deeds spread across my kitchen table like evidence in a case against people I had once trusted more than anyone alive. But then I would think about the porch and the wind chimes and the 3 Agatha Christie novels and my grandmother's hand in mine on the last night of her life, and I would think about the word appropriately in my mother's mouth, and something in me would go very still and very clear. I invited them to dinner. My apartment, not theirs, a small, deliberate reversal of power that I don't think either of them noticed until much later. My mother arrived first, bringing a bottle of wine as though this were an ordinary evening, as though 6 weeks of silence between us was nothing more than a busy schedule. My father came separately later, looking older than I remembered, and I understood, watching him settle stiffly into my second-hand armchair, that some part of him had never fully agreed with what had been done. That he had gone along with it the way he'd gone along with most things in that marriage, by staying quiet and letting my mother steer. Danny came too, at my invitation, bringing an awkward, apologetic energy that told me he suspected something was coming and had no idea what. I didn't raise my voice once. I laid the folder on the table, unopened at first, and I asked my mother a single question. "Did you know Grandma recorded a life estate deed 11 years ago, naming me as the remainder owner of the lake house?" The color left her face so fast it was almost cinematic, and in that instant I had my answer, because innocent people ask what a life estate deed even is. My mother did not ask. My mother went silent in exactly the way she'd gone silent in that kitchen months earlier, the silence of someone doing frantic arithmetic behind still eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, but her voice had lost its calm, and calm, I had learned, was the only weapon she had. I opened the folder. I laid the recorded deed on the table, the county stamp visible, the date visible, my name typed in black and white 11 years before any of this had happened. I watched my father read it, watched his mouth open slightly, watched something crack across his face that might have been the first honest emotion I'd seen from him in a year. I watched Danny read it and put his head in his hands and say, quietly, "Mom, what did you do?" And I understood in that moment that my brother had not known either, that his ignorance had at least been honest, unlike our mothers. And something in my chest loosened just slightly toward him for the first time in months. My mother's confession, when it finally came, was not the dramatic collapse I might have imagined in angrier weeks. It came out sideways, defensive, wrapped in justifications about how much she had sacrificed for that family, how she deserved something too, how she assumed the will superseded whatever old paperwork her mother had done years earlier, how she swore, genuinely had not known the deed existed, that Grandma had never told her, that if she'd known she never would have signed anything. Some of it I believed. Some of it I still, to this day, am not sure I believe, because a woman sharp enough to schedule a house showing 6 weeks after her own mother's funeral is a woman capable of choosing not to look too closely at inconvenient facts. But belief wasn't really the point anymore. The recorded document didn't care what my mother believed. The law didn't care about her intentions. What mattered was what was true, and what was true was written in black and white with a county stamp on it, and no amount of wounded justification could argue its way around that. The legal resolution took nearly 5 months, and I will spare the tedious mechanics of title disputes and rescinded sales, and the very uncomfortable conversation Frank Delgado's attorney had with my mother's attorney once the clouded title became public record. What matters is the outcome. The sale was voided. Frank Delgado, to his credit, did not fight it once his own counsel confirmed the deed was ironclad. He was, after all, in the business of clean transactions, not messy family wars, and he had no appetite for litigating against a properly recorded county document. He received his purchase money back, with the closing costs absorbed by my mother as the party who had made the fraudulent conveyance. Whether through malice or willful blindness, the law ultimately didn't distinguish. The house, the porch, the water view, the room where my grandmother had died with her hand in mine, came back to me, fully, legally, undeniably mine. I did not gloat. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy, in telling this story, to let the ending feel like a triumphant mic drop, and it wasn't, not entirely. There was real grief mixed into the vindication, grief for the mother I thought I'd had before that Tuesday in her kitchen, grief for the family gatherings that would never again feel simple. My father and I are slowly rebuilding something tentative, honest in a way we'd never quite managed before, built on long walks where he finally told me things about his marriage and his own quiet complicity that he'd never said out loud to anyone. My brother and I are closer now than we've been since childhood, He drove out to help me clear the porch of Delgado's half-finished renovation debris, and we hung new wind chimes together, the same brand my grandmother used to like. And neither of us said much while we did it, because some things don't need narration. My mother and I are still finding our way to whatever comes next, if anything does. She has apologized, more than once, in ways that sound more practiced each time, and I've stopped waiting for the apology that will finally feel like enough, because I've realized that isn't the ending I actually need. The ending I needed was simpler than forgiveness. It was the truth, recorded, stamped, undeniable, sitting exactly where my grandmother had quietly placed it 11 years before anyone thought to doubt me. She always said every smart woman keeps insurance nobody knows about. I used to think she meant money. I understand now she meant something better than money. She meant proof. She meant the last word, filed away and waiting for the day someone tried to tell me a lie loud enough to make me forget what was true. I sit on that porch most evenings now, and when the wind moves through the new chimes, I like to think she can still hear it too.